Hey guys, welcome back. So we're picking up where we left off in our last video, which was how to open and close files in C++. So in this video, we're going to actually go into how to read in the data. So here, I've got pretty much what we had in our last video. I've got our input file stream class that I've declared instantiation of. So we got sample file, and then I'm passing into the constructor our sublime sample file.txt. Here I've declared a couple of variables that we're going to use. So if you're not, hopefully you remember this, but if you're not familiar, this is one way to declare multiple strings at once. You can do the same thing with integers. You just need a comma separating them, and I've put in the space here just to make it easier to read. And age is an int. So if we look over here, this is the file we're going to be reading in from. We've got information, then a space. This temp string I have here because we've got age listed in our file a bunch of times and DOB, and we don't actually need that. So we don't need to save that anywhere as long as we know. So we're going to save it under the DOB variable, so we don't need it beside there. Okay. So whenever we open a file too, we talked about how it's good practice to go ahead and close it, and then space down just so you don't forget, and then we'll put all of our information in here. So in this example, I've done something different than in that first video. So here I just made an if statement. So if sample file.isOpen, it's going to execute this code, and if not, then it's going to execute this code, which is just an else statement. File failed to open, and it's going to return out of main. So it's just another way to error detection, different than what I did in that first video. So let's go ahead and look at some of the code here and some of the syntax. This, you're probably wondering, what in the world is he doing here? So I'll explain this. The main thing that is going on here is that we're using this double error operator. And if you'll look up here, I'll explain kind of what happens. The double error operator is known as the extraction operator, and when it's to the right. So in this situation, what happens is that whenever you open a file, there's always a pointer saved here, and it determines where you're at in the file. And as we read through the file, just like you see that the flashing bar right there, it's going to move through the file. And eventually it's going to go through, it's going to read through the whole thing. Once it gets here, there's a hidden character in the file. It's a new line operator, and it'll go down here, and eventually it'll get to the end. At the end of the file, there is a hidden character, and it tells it that it's at the end of the file. So it's kind of like, okay, nothing follows. So what happens with this extraction operator, and the reason we can do this, is the first thing we need to do is we need to reference this class. So this sample file class, and this has the open file in it. So this is a way of manipulating that open file. We're using this sample file class, so it does a lot of work for us. And then by using this extraction operator, what we're telling it to do is start wherever the cursor's at and read until you find a space, and then extract everything in between and put it in first name. And then this next operator does the exact same thing. The cursor will be here at this point, and it will read in until it finds a space and stop. So once it reads in a white space, it's going to stop, and it's going to output that to last name. And then so on and so forth. So the next thing is age here, which I have saved under temp string. And then I've got our actual int age variable, which will be 18. And then date of birth, I've just reused our temp string variable, so this is just getting overwritten. And then the last thing it's going to save is date of birth, which I have here. Okay, so that's what that extraction operator does, and that's what this whole line here is doing. I am showing you this because I've seen it before, and at first looking at it, and without anybody, no one ever tells you what these operators do, which I find very frustrating. But I just wanted you to know what it is if you see something like this. And so while this is true, it's going to be okay. When it reaches the end of the file, it's not going to be able to do this, and it's actually going to return and it'll exit this function, and it'll return just fine. So I'll demonstrate that. What I've done here is I'm just printing out first name. So I could have printed out all or any of these variables, but I just didn't really need to, and I just wanted to show you for the sake of this video that yeah, it is working. My function here, I don't actually have this declared, but I just want to show you that once you've read in all these variable names, they're saved there. And so if you wanted to, you could call a function and you could pass in all these variables to that function. You could also pass by reference if you needed to. So whatever you need to, these variables are the information saved there, so you could pass your function. So if you need to manipulate them, put them into a linked list or whatever, this is one way you can do it. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out that line since I don't have that function actually declared. And we're going to build and run this, and we should expect that this is going to print out first name. So we should expect Jonathan, Sarah, Mike, and Chris all to print out. Let's go ahead and build and run that. Cool. Looks like it worked. So that's how this function works. I'm going to show you a different way that is a lot easier to read and probably what I recommend you do. So I'm going to move over to this other file here. So as you can see in this file, I've got pretty much the same setup here. I've got an input file stream, instance declared. I'm calling it my file stream this time, and then I'm reading in this same text file, so sublime sample file.txt, which I have over here on the right. And I've got a different way of checking to make sure the file is open. I'm using that if statement. If the file is not open, print that out, and just to prove that that works, I'm going to take off the E off the end here. I'll build and run, and you can see file failed to open. Cool. So we'll put that back. Build and run again. Cool. Looks like it's opening. So now we've got a couple of same variables we've declared here, and this is what I want to show you. So let's go ahead and uncomment this out. Here I've got a while. I've got another while loop, and I'm using again the name of this class that I declared, my file stream. And I'm using this function .good. .good is a pretty useful function. It's built in again to input file stream. And what this one does is it checks for several errors, several flags being up. One of the errors that it checks for is that if you're at the end of file, and that is another function too that you can also just use. I'm just going to type it right here, .eof. That's just checks if you're at the end of the file. This .good does .eof, and it does a couple of others to make sure there's no errors or doesn't encounter anything while reading in the file, and if it does, it'll stop. So here I've got pretty much the same thing we had in the other .cpp file that we're looking at, but here I'm saying my file stream each time, and then I'm using the extraction operator here, and I'm putting into each one of these variables. And you know, some of you guys might have been scratching your head. I forgot to point it out the first time I did it, but this operator and class, it actually handles the type conversion for you. This age is an integer, and it handles it. It converts it. It detects here that, okay, this is all integer values, and so I can store this as an integer, and it handles it for you. And it checks, if this was declared as a string, it would also be fine, because it checks, okay, what kind of variable do you want me to put this into? So it's really cool that this file stream class handles, you know, type conversion for you. It's really helpful. And we'll see when we have a comma separator list and we can't use this operator as much, or we have to use a different version of it, overloaded version of it, that it's a lot harder. It's going to be a lot more difficult for us. But it's pretty cool. If you've got just the space separated list, you can just use this operator and it'll handle the type conversion for you without throwing any errors. And we saw that on the first video. So that's the only thing I've really done different here. And you can do the same thing here. So if you had some function you need to pass in the variables, you could do it just like that. And I'll go ahead and build and run this just so you can see. Cool, it prints out everything, Jonathan, Sarah, Mike, and Chris, just fine. So this is a different way of doing it. I like this a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to read. Obviously, it's a lot more lines of code, but a lot easier to read. And if you're trying to, make sure you've covered all your variables and you're going in order, it's a lot easier when you're looking at a list like this as opposed to some really long list, out to the right. So anyways, that's it for this video. We will look at the next video on how to handle a comma separated list. So we'll see you then.